Good morning. Good morning. For 3, I hope, instructive and informative days. I'm going to begin slowly, at the risk of telling you things which I suspect many of you already know, and then shift gears and bring up topics and in details that I think will be unfamiliar to you. So bear with me for a little while, because some of it I'm sure will be familiar. The first part of the outline that I provided is basically that old saw about the oak tree and the acorn. And I think as we get deeper into today's presentation, you'll appreciate how much Jack Kennedy was really the acorn of his father's oak, at least in his private life and in his personal peccadillos. But to begin, it's important to point out that JFK's origins were rooted in a Klan. And the reason is that when he eventually becomes president, the Klan still holds profound meaning for him. He surrounds himself with what others would pejoratively call the Irish Mafia. There will be Kenny O'Donnell and Lawrence O'Brien and of course his own brother Robert, who, as we know, without any experience practicing law, becomes the Attorney General of the United States. And during the missile crisis and other crises of his administration, Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy would have what historians have called unshareables. Only they knew what was going on, and nobody else in the cabinet or in the administration or in those scary 13 days, the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, that weighed our fate in their hands. By the way, if you like Frank Capra movies and you like Capricorn, the screwball comedies of the 1930s, to talk about the Kennedy administration is to deliver something Capra-esque, because we're here today to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We made it. It was a happy ending to the story. But more importantly, think of Jack Kennedy as coming out of a Klan ancestry which never relaxes its control over him. When it comes to being president of the United States, his first source of advice is within the Klan. And by the way, during the Berlin crisis, during the Vienna summit, it is alleged that while his father was still alert and lucid, he would have a massive stroke at the end of 1961, Jack was calling Joe 3 and 4 times a day, sometimes more. So the family is central. The Klan is central. And everything else becomes, in a sense, though I distort to be sure, window dressing. The Kennedy Klan traced its American roots to immigrants fleeing Ireland's potato famine in the 1840s. It's not an uncommon story for Irish Americans. The roots go back to the tragic British policies that caused so many Irish either to die or to head across the pond. Its history of the Klan, that is a tale of assimilation and Americanization. Patrick Kennedy began as a barrel maker. So as you see, there were no silver spoons at the beginning, though there would be many silver spoons in this family later on. He lived in the first major immigrant ghetto in America, in Boston. And the road out, as it was for so many Irish Americans who worked their way up the social ladder, was through the saloon and local politics. Not all other ethnic groups would follow in the footsteps of the Irish. Eventually, a better life was secured, mainly through banking and liquor importing. About that, I'll have a little more to say in a while. The patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy, rejected the old ways, and he defied the Catholic clergy's warnings. Don't attend those Protestant schools. They're not only occasions of sin, there's terrible sinfulness going on in those schools. And so he attended the Boston Latin School, where he was elected president of his class, and then on to Harvard, where he never made it into the prestigious social clubs. These were the first big cracks in the Irish tribalism of the Kennedys. Tribalism never collapsed, but there were cracks. JFK followed in his footsteps. He went where, Bill, to prep school? Choate.
With the Canterbury, and then left and went to Choate.
I can always count on the footnotes, thank you.
Still throw away, yeah.
Yeah, Choate's having its own troubles these days, yes, we know that. And then he went on to Harvard from 36 to 40. So he's broken out of the mold. And not only is the mold being shattered educationally, but Joe decides that there's going to be more than degrees to set them apart. He moves the family to Brookline, Massachusetts, out of the ghetto, which was then almost entirely a Protestant enclave outside of Boston. But then Joe did something very calculating, not unlike Lyndon Johnson, who decided that the way up was to marry well. He yoked his ambitions to those of the Fitzgeralds, and he married Rose, the daughter of a 3-term Boston mayor, excuse me, the first Irish Catholic who was ever mayor of Boston. And this was before World War I. And actually was a congressman too. He violated all the social taboos. And Joe knew that this would be the route for his extraordinary, vaulting ambitions for himself and for his family. So he marries into a bona fide Irish upper-class family. And then, at the risk of repetition, he has a large brood of 9 children. Born in 1917, a century ago, John was their chronically sick second child. Every biography you'll read of Jack Kennedy of late emphasizes, underscores, italicizes just how sick he was. And as somebody mentioned yesterday, I think it was Mark, how many times he had, for a Catholic, the last rites. I mean, tottering just on, crossing the sticks, if you like your Greek images. So the old neighborhoods are being left behind. It's strange that as he leaves the old neighborhoods, as he puts distance between himself and that Irish tribal past, it will be those very people who will be the absolute rock-ribbed foundation of his political rise. During the bull market of the 1920s, Joe became a stock market manipulator. By the way, by the age of 25, he's the president of a bank. He's not only enormously ambitious, he's enormously talented. But then he realizes that the place to be in the 20s, there are 2 places you should be, Wall Street and Hollywood, the epicenters, basically, of American mass culture. He enriched himself in part because of his skill as an insider, as an inside trader, or he enriched himself because he understood the wizardry of insider trading. It was not yet illegal because the securities market in the 1920s was largely unregulated. Now, who do you think will end up in the 30s overseeing the stock market? Joe Kennedy. He'll be the first director of the Securities and Exchange Commission appointed by President Franklin Roosevelt. While this is going on, the family is uprooted again and they're moved to Riverdale, just north of Manhattan, so he can be closer to the stock market, Wall Street, where he makes a nice, tidy fortune, trading on inside information and trading just at the right times. He's in many ways an Irish Ishmael, because the millionaire then goes off in the 20s to Hollywood. During those years where he emerged as a force in the film industry, he doesn't make any memorable films. He just makes additional millions by producing B-grade movies that were being consumed voraciously by the American public. There was a time when we went to a movie house and there would be sometimes 3 movies. 2 B grades, the feature, some short subjects, a news tone. It was a whole day. You could go on a Saturday afternoon. Well, one of the people feeding this inexhaustible appetite for celluloid entertainment was Joe Kennedy, and he made a fortune, another fortune. These were also years when he was, an absentee father and husband, a notorious philanderer. Indeed, there seemed to be a competition between he and his son Jack as to who was the most accomplished philanderer. It's good that your father sets high standards for you. Very good. His extramarital affairs included one, as you probably know, with actress Gloria Swanson, the most famous. Not the only one, but the one that was most talked about. Rose remained long-suffering back on the East Coast. Or she just pulled up her roots and went to Europe for a couple of months. She couldn't take the brood. 9 children around the house, this is too much. And the kids basically were raised by governesses and au pairs and whatever else when you have silver spoons is taking care of your children. With the luck of the Irish, though, Joe sold his stock holdings just before the crash in October 1929. That stroke of good fortune proved absolutely crucial to the family's future financial security and the creation of a political dynasty on which it rested after World War II. And for those of you who are interested in the philosophy of history, it is more proof of the importance of contingency in the unfolding of events. There is no Kennedy dynasty if Joe Kennedy holds on to that money a few more days, a few more weeks. He rides Enron down to 34 cents. He doesn't do it. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but it captures the, I think, essence of Joe Kennedy's good fortune. He's in Palm Springs, where they have a winter home. And he goes to get his shoes shined. And the bootblack, or shoe shine man, says, "Mr. Kennedy, I've heard that such and such can only go up. That stock is a winner." And Joe Kennedy says to himself, if the bootblack thinks he can understand the market and get rich on it, I'm getting out. And the next day, he dumped him. He dumped everything. Now, during the Great Depression, Joe Kennedy makes another critical decision. Unlike almost all big businessmen in America, he throws in with Franklin Roosevelt. You can count on one hand all the prominent businessmen who thought that Franklin Roosevelt was a political horse to ride. Amadeo Giannini of the Bank of America. Why? Well, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is bailing out the Bank of America. Tom Watson, IBM. Who's going to get the census contract? Who's going to take care of Social Security? All those whole earth tabulating machines that Tom Watson is going to sell and use. Edward Filene, Boston department store magnate, and Joe Kennedy. There aren't many. So Joe it wasn't a big risk, but he took a risk. At least he was willing to accept the slurs and the criticisms at the country club. He raised a whopping $150,000 for Roosevelt's political war chest. And he joined as well in his campaigning for president. He lent Roosevelt another $50,000, multiply that by 10 to get a sense of today's dollars. And that was never repaid in cash. Joe's not a bad businessman. He knows that there are other currencies that you can be paid back in. It doesn't have to be drachmas, ducats, doubloons. Joe received licenses as a franchised importer of Hagen Haig Scotch and Gordon's Gin. So every time you drink a nice Hagen Haig on the rocks, you're tossing money into the Kennedy clan. It's all in anticipation of the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, although there are some scholars who insist that he had been bootlegging even before Prohibition ended. It's hard to prove that one, but. And in a most controversial appointment that I alluded to earlier, Franklin Roosevelt rewards Joe for services rendered with the chairmanship of the Securities and Exchange Commission, a brand new government agency, and in effect, he put the fox in charge of the hen house. And he is Securities and Exchange Commissioner in 1934 and 1935. And then he's appointed as American ambassador to the Court of St. James's to Great Britain in 1938, where he serves until 1940. Just turn that off for a moment. As you can see, Jack understood formal attire. He grew up in a family where the American ambassador to Great Britain was his father. He's got a sense of, now that's a pejorative, the pinstripe crowd, the pinstripe pants crowd. But he was always extraordinarily fastidious and elegant. But I attribute this look to a sense in which the ambassadorial corps was well known to him. He traveled all over Europe in the late 30s with his father, opening doors and running interference. And he lived in the American embassy in Paris for a while. Let's see, that would have been in his senior year at Harvard when he was writing his honors thesis. So the ambassador's public life ends in 1940. That's the end of the road for Joe's own ambitions, political ambitions. And as is well known, Joe expected Joe Jr. to carry the torch for the family. And Joe Jr. is killed in a plane accident during World War II. So reluctantly, the second sickly child accepts the mantle from the fallen older brother Joseph. The ambassador's son's public life begins 6 years after his father's ended. In 1946, Joe effectively, and I use this word advisedly, bought his pampered and privileged son, boy, a seat in the House of Representatives. Jack was then 29 years old. And as they would say in my generation in the 50s, he was trying to find himself. In those days, you went to Australia and did some surfing, while you're trying to find yourself. Finding yourself also meant that you had a father who could pay the dime to go and surf in Australia. At any rate, Jack doesn't know what he wants. He's very reluctant to get into politics. He's not an especially good public speaker. He's sick quite often. But at least his father understood. You start your son off in a rotten borough. You get him in a solid Democratic district in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ain't no Republican going to win in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And in the outcome, favorable outcome, Jack Kennedy owed his success to 4 factors. 1, his father Joe. 2, his father Joe's money. 3, his father Joe's ambition for his son. 4, his father Joe's capacity for scheming. Those are the 4 factors. Now, why do I say this? Does anybody know whose seat Jack Kennedy took in 1946? Whose seat in the House?
Honey Fitz.
Honey Fitz. No. He actually took the seat of that all-time rascal in Massachusetts politics, James Michael Curley. And how does he convince James Michael Curley to step aside? Well, it just so happens James Michael Curley had lots of unpaid debts. And Father Joe says, Michael, if you had just given my son a chance, I'll take care of all those outstanding obligations you have. Don't worry about it. So he does it in the old-fashioned way. Cash on the barrel. Cash on the barrel. Cash in an envelope. None of these subtleties like future equities or anything like that. No. Joe himself summed up the victory probably best when he said, quote, "With what I'm spending, I could elect my chauffeur," unquote. By the way, this is an election in which the future is foretold, because Jack will be reelected in 48, he'll be reelected in 50, and time again, nobody can match Father Joe's, Franklin's, and it's not a $100 bill. Grant? Anyway, his presidents that he's willing to fork over. While in the House from 47 to 49, JFK provides a preview of his presidency. On domestic issues, he votes all over the spectrum. There is no ideological rigor to Jack Kennedy when it comes to domestic policy. Sometimes he votes conservatively, sometimes he votes liberally, sometimes he's just a pragmatist who's horse trading. His votes defy any kind of categorization, and certainly any ideological label. He was, however, a consistent anti-communist in foreign policy, and this is important to recall when we get further into his career and particularly into his abbreviated presidency. He comes to power, or let me put it this way, he defines himself in foreign policy as somebody who believes that Harry Truman and George Marshall lost China. He is one of the prominent Democrats who beats that drum and who uses the accusatory rhetorical question, who lost China? Well, everybody knows it's the Democrats lost China. It wasn't Chiang Kai-shek, of course, or the Kuomintang. And so, and Joe, and Jack and Joe, his father, are always friendly to Joseph McCarthy. Joe is a visitor at their house, and when the vote comes to censure Joe McCarthy, Jack's nowhere to be found. There is no vote. So, in many ways, Jack on foreign policy is a hardline anti-communist who is intrigued by conspiracy theories. And the notion that the State Department was full of pinkos and traitors and were willing to sell Chiang Kai-shek down the river was something that he thought was perfectly compelling. The big test of the power of his father's money, however, and of his own popularity came in 1952, because he's running against a truly formidable opponent. And that is
Camelot.
very good, Bill. Henry Cabot Lodge.
Still red hair.
He's got himself a problem. He's got an established Boston Brahmin, symbol of the New England waspdom, who only talks. Well, he's got only the Lowells probably. They don't talk to the Cabots and Lodges, and Henry Cabot Lodge is very well liked and respected. So the election pits a parvenu Catholic against the Boston Brahmin, and it doesn't look good. With Joe's money, though, once again flowing freely, because Joe actually, in effect, bought a newspaper in Boston. It was the Boston Post. Not a very good paper, but better than the Hearst paper. God, my father used to read that. I couldn't believe it, but anyway. But what he did was to convince the editor of the Post, which was a struggling newspaper. In fact, it was on the verge of bankruptcy, to swing all of his editorials and all of his political writing behind Jack and against a fellow Brahmin, Henry Cabot Lodge. In the exchange for, now get this, we're going to do the Cuban Missile Crisis tomorrow. There's a deal struck. And the deal is this. I won't say anything. You put that paper squarely behind my boy, and when it's all over, I'll give you a $500,000 loan to keep this business floating. And that's exactly how things were done. You promote Jack's candidacy in the local press, and lo and behold, Jack pulled a major upset. He beats Henry Cabot Lodge. It's less than 3% of the vote. It's not razor thin, but it's a damn close margin. And one could argue that having the post behind you might have been the decisive or critical factor. Lodge, however, would cast a long shadow. He would remain in Jack's life. Remember, he'll be Richard Nixon's vice presidential running mate in '60, another razor-thin margin, but we'll deal with that in a little while. And then, in the critical month of November, 1963, Cabot Lodge becomes the American ambassador in Saigon and is the one who basically winks at the coup that overthrows No Dinh Diem. Wink may be a kind word. Let's put it this way, nobody bothered to tell Big Min and the military conspirators who launched the coup that Diem his life should be spared. And so there was no warning to the coup, to the coosters. Such a word? Coosters? I like it. Coosters. So one of the saddest things is that Kennedy is said to have leapt up from his chair when he heard that Diem had been assassinated, killed, and ran out of the room. But it was Arthur Schlesinger who wrote that, and there's much that Arthur Schlesinger has written that hasn't stood up to a more rigorous scrutiny by historians. There's no evidence that Kennedy, instructed the ARVN generals to kill him, but there's also no evidence that he told them not to kill him. So now it's time, he's preparing the ground for the White House. He's beaten Henry Cabot Lodge. It's a big obstacle surmounted given his father's prodigious ambitions for his son. He's wanted one of his sons to become president ever since the 1930s. In preparing the ground for the White House, as a senator, JFK takes 3 giant steps. And it's not clear whether they're intentional or inadvertent. And they may be, as so often happens in reality, a strange blend of the two, intentional and inadvertent. What we do know is that they enhanced his future presidential prospects by enlarging an undeserved reputation. And so much of what ushers JFK into the White House is this undeserved reputation. It's the nature of politics. Politicians get image makers and propagandists and court historians to put a certain significance or meaning, which, like a soap bubble, dissipates when you look at it closely with the documentary evidence. All of these steps gilded his public image. In 1953, for example, the 36-year-old Playboy bachelor marries Jacqueline Bouvier, 12 years younger. If you're going to get married as a bachelor, get somebody 12 or 15 years younger. It lends a certain luster to your descent into familyhood. More importantly, the marriage lent him the veneer, operative word, the veneer of a family man. Would you give me that picture of, yeah. A ravishing couple. All that glitters, though, as Shakespeare said, is not gold. But they were something to remember. And then in the mid-1950s, the second shoe fell. He took the next big step. He wrote a bestseller, Profiles in Courage, with considerable unacknowledged assistance from his speechwriter Ted Sorensen, and little known, the Georgetown historian Jules Davids. Not David, Davids. In a sworn affidavit, Sorensen later denied that he was the book's ghostwriter, which won him, as I told Mark last night, in some circles, the Pinocchio Prize. It's not a nice, you got the Pulitzer, you get the Pinocchio, it goes. Now, whoever its true author was, the book did win for JFK a Pulitzer Prize in biography, or for biography, in 1957. Now, combine this Pulitzer Prize, which is certainly greatly touted and greatly ballyhooed as Kennedy is engaged in his run-up to the presidency. We've got an intellectual running for the White House. Did you say Ted Sorensen's running for the White House? But if you combine this with his senior thesis at Harvard, revised with the help of the New York Times columnist Arthur Kroc, who was a friend of Joe Kennedy, very close to Joe Kennedy, and published in 1940 as Why England Slept. Arthur Kroc gave it the title, Why England Slept. It was a ripoff of Winston Churchill's book. A ripoff in terms of the title, not in terms of the substance. All of this gave JFK, on the road to the White House, the patina of an intellectual. The patina. You got the veneer, you got the patina. And when I'm going for that next step, I'm trying to think of a nice synonym, so bear with me. And then he has his political coming out party on a national stage in the 1956 Democratic Convention. It provided the country, the entire country, with visibility. It gave JFK a visibility throughout the country and a free publicity, which contributed mightily to his future nomination as the Democratic candidate. He narrated a film and he delivered a nominating speech in support of Adlai Stevenson, who, by the way, he would later throw right under the bus in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was the appeaser. He was the soft member of ex-com. So all of this helps his role at the convention. He captures the imagination of many in the Democratic Party. He's the matinee idol who now becomes a press favorite. He's the Gregory Peck who has entered politics. And it's hard to overstate the importance of appearance in a celebrity-driven culture. The man looks too good to be true. But then again, so did William Westmoreland when he took over McVie in the 1960s. He looked like a perfect general. He should have been. Appearances. For the party's kingmakers, the clincher occurred in his 1958 re-election campaign for the Senate. And all of this is remarkably systematic. Kennedy is working under the guidance of Joe and others who are convinced he can do it. Every step is carefully planned. In that contest, he receives a record-breaking 74% of the popular vote. 74% of the vote. And I must make personal mention that I went out and distributed campaign literature for Kennedy in that 1958 campaign, for which I received an autographed thank you note and letter from Jack Kennedy. And it became, for my mother, part of the shrine. You know? There were the perfectly mint Kennedy silver dollars or half dollars? Half dollars was a big part of my inheritance. I got the Kennedy half dollars. They had never been in circulation. But That letter I received from Jack Kennedy thanking me for, at the age of 14, for helping him in his election, is one of the unforgettables and unsharables. His landslide victory suggested that a 1960 presidential nomination was a realistic ambition. Still, those who knew him well understood the considerable baggage that he would carry in facing off against his Republican opponent. Not the least of his liabilities, not the least of the albatrosses that he had to get off his neck, was that he was absolutely notorious on Capitol Hill for his chronic absenteeism and missed roll calls. He had never been a dutiful tribune of the American people. Certainly had never been a dutiful tribune of the people of Massachusetts. Rollo the rich kid did what he wanted. And that is one of the endemic problems of Rollo the rich kids. The poor kid climbing his way up tends to do things that will foster his ambition. When Rollo gets there, he's insouciant about his duties and his obligations. And then there was the obstacle of his Catholicism, of which even Eleanor Roosevelt made a big issue for a time until she finally decided that maybe he was the better of the choices. She reluctantly threw the old Democratic Party. She was always a Stevenson person, and eventually she came over to Kennedy's side. But for a long time, she made a big issue of Catholicism. Would you show that next one? This is just one illustration of the anti-Catholic propaganda that went around the country, reminiscent of what went on in the 1830s and 1840s when the Know-Nothings went after Catholic candidates. Read that for me. Be sure to do what your Papa tells you. Right. Back in the 1840s, there was allegedly a subterranean tunnel that went from the Vatican to the United States. Never mind, it doesn't make any, it's not logical anyway, but anyway, it's revived, and religion is a big obstacle. Now, on the other hand, there's a flip side. I mean, Roman Catholics voted overwhelmingly for Jack Kennedy, so there's a strong resentment to the anti-Catholicism, so you get the anti-Catholicism vote that's in play. Thank you, Rob. Having suggested that religion was a factor, and it was a factor, it's important to note that once again, Joe's money comes into play. Because the way Kennedy diagnosed the road to the White House, he had to win Wisconsin and West Virginia in the primaries. By the way, in 1960, they didn't have the mania we have today where every state has a primary. There were a few primaries. Basically, the nomination is determined at the convention. But if you want to give people a feel for your electability, then go into those few primaries that existed. He went into Wisconsin and he won. He beat Hubert Humphrey in Wisconsin, which was revealing. But Wisconsin's a heavily Catholic state, so that didn't prove that didn't put to rest the religious issue. But then he went to West Virginia, part of the Bible Belt, right?
Yeah.
Les? And now, I hate to say this, but West Virginia in those days ranked right up with Duval County, Texas, and Cook County, Illinois, for its corruption. And in came the Kennedy machine. And money, we can't, there's no way, there's no paper trail that we can absolutely establish how much money went into the West Virginia campaign. But Kennedy won overwhelmingly. He drove Hubert Humphrey right out of the election. And so by that time you could say, you could at least speculate that the religious issue is being put to rest. Not quite. One could make a compelling case that without, hold on to your seats now, because this may be new to you, and I may find, as I should, some pushback. One could make a compelling case that without Sputnik, Kennedy would have remained a senator for the remainder of his public life. shows you how history is so odd and curious. A 180-pound aluminum sheathed beeping satellite is really the key to Kennedy becoming President of the United States? Yes, yes, I think we can make that brief. And I think the brief will hold up in court. The Soviet satellite and all it symbolized provided the winning issue in his run for the White House. JFK rode a wave of national soul-searching and finger-pointing over Moscow's this is the operative word, apparent superiority in science and technology. America is hysterical in 1958 and 1959. Indeed, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Sputnik either, because without the NDEA fellowship that I received, I couldn't have gone to graduate school. But we decided at that point, maybe we're lagging behind in education. We need scientists, we need mathematicians. Oh yes, we need a few historians who might be able to write about this later on too. Yes. While Kennedy is young and vigorous and energetic, at least he appeared that way, and he's a post-Sputnik political phenomenon. Because if anything tarnished the luster of Dwight David Eisenhower, it was Sputnik. And the mythology that somehow we had fallen terribly behind the communists, terribly behind the Kremlin in space and in science and in technology. Dwight Eisenhower is no longer the guy who brilliantly led the D-Day invasion. He's 71 years old. He's always on the golf course. He seems to be barely keeping up with his responsibilities. So he's in a different light. And Kennedy is the perfect foil. And as if the Republicans as if the Republicans were Jack Kennedy's MVP, because they choose as their candidate Eisenhower's vice president. If the reaction in America is to this sense that we're falling behind, that there are gaps everywhere, so that most people were willing to coin a new word called gapitis. What's America suffering from? Gapitis. We're behind in space. We're behind in rockets. We're behind in everything. There's no end to the gaps. And of course, Jack Kennedy's the man coming in on the white horse who's going to help to close those gaps. As one historian has put it, he benefited from a country in quest of a fresh sense of national purpose. And we know that America was ready for something different. There was a huge voter turnout in November 1960. Not like the ersatz banana republic elections we have had of late, where maybe 45 or 50% of the vote turns out. 67% of eligible voters, 69 million in all, cast ballots, with Kennedy winning by just, I have no more candy, so if you want to answer this question, there's no reward. Huh? 118,000 votes. Yes, definitely. As close, virtually a dead heat. Virtually a dead heat. Although in the Electoral College he does defeat Nixon by 84 votes. However, if he loses Illinois and Texas, Nixon wins the Electoral College. It's that close. The margin is that thin. So how does he win by such a razor-thin margin? I take the historian's easy way out. Multiple factors determine the outcome. There is no silver bullet. Let's start with what Kennedy was so remarkably adept at, and that is the new technology of television. The power of television and an image-conscious, celebrity-driven culture, to which I made brief allusion earlier. In 1960, 88% of American households had one or more TVs. 88%. It even exceeded the number of radios that were in households. And an estimated 70 million Americans watched their first debate, the first of a kind. There had never been any presidential debates in American history up till now. So this is the first. And indeed, there were 4 debates. Of the 4 debates, this one carried the most lasting significance, because this is the one people remembered. It's the one that imprinted most deeply on them. JFK's good looks played a big role. I wish I could tell you that there's a more cerebral approach that Americans take to politics. But, you know, in those days, a John Lindsay, a Jack Kennedy, they were thought to be our conception of what a politician should be. No Fiorello LaGuardia anymore. We're not going to have any dumpy Italians with Jewish parents and who speak 7 languages and whose hair's all mussed up. Those days are over. You got to be fastidious and meticulous and tall. I feel bad. You got to be tall to be a politician. The short, when people run for office, it's usually the tall guy that wins. Tall guy that wins. I mean, I'm concerned about coal miners too, but I'm worried about short people. They keep getting mistreated. No. In truth, Jack Kennedy gave a much better visual performance than Nixon did. Okay? Lots of Americans vote and voted then with their eyes. If we examine the 4 debates, one of their oddest features was that JFK was the picture of robust good health. And Nixon was at a disadvantage in a visual medium. Because he shot himself in the foot. In the first debate, he foolishly refused to wear professional makeup. Why does Nixon do anything? He opts for an application of lazy shave to hide his 5 o'clock shadow. So he looks semi-ghoulish on TV. Is he just emerged from a sepulcher? Who is that candidate? It was a big mistake. It was a big mistake. Americans who viewed the debate thought JFK won. Those who listened to it on the radio came to an opposite conclusion. Tell me that visual medium doesn't affect transmissions, synaptic transmissions in the brain. Kennedy and his advisors understood well just how telegenic he was. He was remarkably telegenic. He was the first president to permit his press conferences to be televised live. Why? Because he could have mangled syntax with Eisenhower and still would have been approved because he looked so good. Mangling syntax? What do Americans care about that? In fact, there are people who have argued that Richard Nixon was so admired because he spoke so wretchedly, he was just like the people. Ike, by the way, had his press conferences filmed and then they were edited. But then spliced into the news in the evening, occasionally. They weren't used very much. And how long did that news last back in the 1960s? 15 minutes. I'm going to get all my candy. 15 minutes. So not many people, while Ike was president, really got to see much of him in the form of a press conference. And then, of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy threw down the gauntlet live on television. And whether you followed his logic or his reasoning, he evoked a sympathy that was extraordinary in that. Scared the bejesus out of me, but he evoked sympathy. And then the myth of Camelot received a powerful boost from 3 days of post-assassination mourning that was given maximum TV coverage. It seemed like it was never going to end. TV, virtually round the clock, was taking us into the Camelot mythology. Wow. In other words, TV was to JFK what tweets are to Donald Trump. They each have gravitated toward a preferred medium. They each gravitate toward, or one gravitated, one gravitates now. Larry Sabato's Verdict, where's Mark? Extraordinary book on Kennedy. And in that book, in his assessment of the Kennedy years, Larry Sabato's Verdict is well worth heeding. And if you haven't read it, do read it. It's a lot longer than Alan Brinkley's. He said, quote, JFK was a stellar visual and vocal artist. And indeed he was. His was actually a hybrid persona, the product of superb speechwriters like Ted Sorensen and image makers of exceptional talent too, as well as of his own extraordinarily natural gifts of grace, charm, and eloquence. We have a hybridization. He's got great speechwriters. He's got great image makers. But he's a hell of a product, very easy to be sold too. He's charming, he's graceful, he's eloquent, and he's devilish. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Throughout his campaign, JFK came across to his supporters as tougher on communism than Nixon. And it's one of the things that in after-election interviews people mentioned. They thought he would handle Khrushchev better than Richard Nixon. Some responsibility for Nixon's defeat must be shared by Dwight Eisenhower himself. In August, 3 months before the election, Ike was asked at a press conference, "What major decision has the vice president ever participated in?" To which he replied, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." Now, Ike's belittling added more tarnish to Nixon's public image. His blunder clearly hurt a fellow Republican. But that was all part of the tension that had been building up between Nixon and Eisenhower during the 1950s. And then, lest we forget the maestro of the Senate, the greatest politician perhaps in the history of the Republic, it was LBJ's crucial assistance that swung 7 southern states, including Texas, into JFK's column. Without LBJ, it's an unthinkable. It's an unthinkable. If Nixon, as I mentioned earlier, had won Illinois and Texas, he would have become president. Instead, he lost Illinois by 8,800 votes and Texas by 46,000 votes. The Daley machine in Cook County delivered just enough votes, as they always do. Republican charges of fraud in those 2 states went unproven. This is important to underline. It wasn't that Nixon just walked away and accepted the outcome. There was a recount in Illinois, but the original vote, Eureka, remained unchanged. But they did go through a formal process of recounting. Judges in Texas, however, refused to order a recount there. And we'll never know what went on in Duval County with the Parr brothers, how would I say, paying for prior services rendered, yes. So why was the election so close? I think, at bottom, widespread fear of a Catholic in the White House contributed heavily. 54% of all Protestants voted against JFK. And for the first time in American history, a candidate won with only a minority of Protestant voters. The religious factor was still alive. It was being diluted. But in the Bible Belt, it remained a very strong factor. It wasn't like Al Smith in 1928, where whole ballot boxes were tossed in the nearby river to make sure no Catholic from New York City with a brown derby was going to go into the White House. Bill, you had a question?
What's that?
I said, did you have a question? I thought your hand was up.
No.
Okay. Now we get to a subject which I think my colleagues on the faculty will be covering to varying depths in the days ahead. And so let me just move on to one of the most exceptional debates ever to occur in this republic. And that is, who killed JFK? I once talked to a theologian about this problem of responsibility for the assassination of Kennedy. And he said, this reminds me of what John Calvin once said about those who take the time to study the book of Revelations. Namely, that they're crazy either when they begin the undertaking or they're crazy when they end the undertaking. There's much to be said about that. much to be said. There is also much that's ironic about the unfortunate death of John Kennedy. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, the right-wing John Birch Society, founded by the businessman Robert Welch, candy maker, a child prodigy from rural North Carolina, who had established his organization in December of 1958, and that's now headquartered in my home state of Wisconsin, in Appleton, Wisconsin. At that time, its headquarters was located in Belmont, Massachusetts, a suburb outside of Boston. In other words, right in JFK's own backyard. That ad that the John Birch Society ran in the Dallas newspapers on the day of Kennedy's assassination was, to put it mildly, inflammatory. It accused Kennedy of being soft on communists, if not being a crypto-communist. After all, the John Birch Society had already erected billboards all over the country insisting that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist and at the head of the international communist conspiracy. So it's a communist-mongering society, and it implied that President Kennedy was pro-communist. There were many Americans who thought that the founder and head of the society was as nutty as some of his candy bars. And I liked his candy bars. They're pretty good. Kennedy's reaction to the charge was to dismiss Dallas itself as nut country. Remember, just a few weeks before, Adlai Stevenson had shown up in Dallas, and he had been knocked around and punched and spat upon, and it was an ugly scene, and it was troublesome. But it turned out to be a representative of the radical left rather than the radical right who fired the assassin's bullet. Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old lone gunman, had openly identified himself with Castro's Cuba. And he had lived and worked in the Soviet Union for nearly 3 years. He was a self-styled Marxist. So I leave you with this note as the witching hour approaches and the question and answer period commences. History seldom lives up to the script assigned to it. Thank you. Now,
I got a question. Interesting, when Kennedy was a senator, just a little thought. One other thing, you would agree, that helped him in his campaign, he was perceived, a little bit exaggerated, war hero. Nixon was supply officer in the Pacific, and that was a big thing.
PT 109 buttons,
PT 109.
emblems, and actually they were metal. They were distributed widely during the campaign, and as usually happens with
The film came out.
with exaggerated tales, he got low marks for seamanship, for how he commanded the PT boat, high marks for heroism, and that he did in fact, despite all his physical infirmities, which were many, he did in fact help to he attended to some needy sailors.
A little aside, my roommate here was soccer captain, Peter Preston's father won the Medal of Honor. He was Kennedy's superior officer. And the movie came out while we were in college, 1962 or 3. And his father told me, Chevy Chase, could have been court-martialed. He said, you don't ram a plywood PT boat into a Japanese destroyer.
Well, the destroyer rammed him.
Yeah.
He didn't have there was no radar. It was at night.
Father tried to get on the Silver Star.
Well, his father also rigged his physical exams. He did not pass the initial physicals he took because he was so sick.
And one little comment on the Wisconsin, which you know well, is ironic or good fate for Kennedy that he was recuperating from a back operation on the censure vote on McCarthy, right?
Right, but he also, that's right, but he could have gotten there. That was a family decision,
It was a tough vote for him.
not to betray their longtime social association with Joe McCarthy. Yeah, but what I did mention was that his physical condition was so appalling that on a day-to-day basis, he virtually consumed a pharmacopoeia of drugs. I mean, codeine, procaine, steroids, anabolic steroids. I mean, it's truly amazing how much speed he had. A doctor dubbed Dr. Feelgood, who used to give him amphetamines, speed to stay vigorous. He had Addison's disease, which was being barely managed by the drugs he was taking, the steroids basically that he was taking for that. It's anybody's guess how much longer he would have lived under such. I mean, Lyle Alzado didn't make it, and I think Jack Kennedy would have been lucky if he made it to his early 50s, given how many drugs he was ingesting. He was also taking. He had insomnia, so he was taking what back then was a nerve paralyzing drug. I forget what it was. Anyway, if you go back and read Robert Dallek, who's very good on this, you step back from the book, you can't believe how much is being taken every day, and he's still functioning. So, yeah. Yes, Andy?
David Greenberg spends a lot of time in his book about the presidency, The Spin, and talks an awful lot. Who actually taught Kennedy to speak? Because when he's a congressman, he's known as a halting, kind of a chaotic speaker, and by the time he runs for president, he is the epitome of the American orator.
You know, the classroom is a bad place for this answer because we assume that everything is, it's learned out of a book. But it's really what the Greeks call praxis. It's trial and error. And what Jack Kennedy did was he spoke enough that finally epiphanies occurred, lights went on, and this is how you talk to people. And yet, I mean, he always was troublesome in the South because he had that thick, wicked Boston accent. Yeah, wicked. So, yes, sir.
Okay, what about Joe Kennedy? I read in the book that Joe Kennedy and his other son, Robert Kennedy, were in charge of JFK's campaign.
Yes. Robert Kennedy was the master organizer. Yes, for which he was rewarded with an unwarranted cabinet position, which then became proof, I think, where I started this presentation, proof of the durability of Irish clannishness. Okay. Yes?
I just have a quote from the Wall Street Journal from Niall Ferguson, and he said, here's one contemporary verdict of the Kennedy administration written before the president's death. It had demoralized the bureaucracy and much of the military, and it had engaged in government by improvisation and manipulation. It had relied on public relations gimmicks. It had no respect for personal dignity and treated people as tools. It had brutalized our allies within NATO. It was undermining the U.S. reputation for reliability, the most important asset any nation has. The State Department was a shambles, demoralized by the weakness of the Secretary of State and the interference of the White House. Its foreign policy was essentially a house of cards.
Well, that would provide me with a classic illustration of hyperbole.
Okay.
I mean, historians shouldn't be in the business of hyperbolic assessments. I mean, right away I say this trash mashes a much more complex reality. And by the way, that's the nature of editorializing anyway. You don't have the time to really get into the next layer of depth of the story or to see it in a more balanced way. That's why I don't go to op-ed pages. Yes?
I lived through all that as a sentient and mature person, so I remember.
Living memory.
Well, I never heard the term Camelot used to describe his administration until after he was assassinated. And I'm just wondering, where did that come from?
It was the deliberate and willful creation of Jacqueline Kennedy. After the cortege went down in the riderless horse and the extraordinary solemnity of his trip to Arlington National Cemetery and the Eternal Flame, she called in a journalist by the name of Teddy White, Theodore White. And she told him this remarkable, I think, hooey story about Jack Kennedy, who at night would listen to the musical score of Camelot, which was then playing on Broadway. And, you know, the imagery of an Arthurian round table with the best and the brightest talking to King Arthur, I mean, maudlin and, to me, repugnant. You know? But it caught on. I mean, it captured the needs of the American public. And Camelot is a post-presidential creation. And it would live on, particularly since the first people to write histories of the Kennedy years were court historians, Ted Sorensen and Arthur Schlesinger. They set the agenda for how subsequent historians would make sense of the Kennedy years. And for the longest time, Camelot was what you wrote up against. And then Tom Reeves came along, Robert Dallek, and began demolishing the Camelot thesis of Schlesinger and Sorensen. But don't forget, just before Kennedy was assassinated, a very deliberately destructive book was high on the New York Times book list by Victor Lasky called JFK, Man and the Myth. And when Kennedy was assassinated, all the publishing houses pulled the book. And if you go back and take a look at Lasky's Man and the Myth, you'll see a lot of similarities to what would be coming in Tom Reeves's Question of Character and other books, which sought to give a more balanced account. And one of the most absurd things about Camelot is it made out a dysfunctional family to be an idealized family. I mean, why Schlesinger and Sorensen suppressed that feature? It wasn't Camelot. When the womanizing of Jack Kennedy is, I think Alan Brinkley puts it this way, pathological. Or I think, no, he hedged. Nearly pathological. I mean, it's unbelievable. I think, why didn't I get that testosterone? By the way, one of the things he was getting every day was testosterone shots. No wonder he was the three-pecked owl. It was unbelievable. But, I'm sorry, yes.
I'd like to bring W&L back into this in a small way. You got here in 71, the mock convention was in 60. Do you recall many of the professors talking about that mock convention, exactly what happened at the W&L mock convention, which either occurred in, I guess, April or May of 1960, because it was sort of interesting.
I cannot help you on that, but I can ask somebody in the audience who might have been there in 60.
Yeah, I was at the 1960, and Harry Truman was the guest speaker.
Right.
And but it was really interesting because all of the students were, in a word, enamored of this Kennedy image at the time. And ultimately, as has been the case with many W&L conventions, they got it right. Kennedy got the nomination. But it was, you know, I was finishing my freshman year, and there was a very interesting convention. I still vividly recall Truman speaking, everybody yelling, "Give him hell, Harry," you know, and all that kind of thing. But there was a lot of myth, if you will, about this image of Kennedy.
Can I add
And
something?
he did get the nomination.
It took 6 votes, okay, and 2 states that did change their votes from Johnson to Kennedy were one southern state and the state of New York. And in those days, we could call someone we thought we knew in those senators' offices or the governor's office, trying to go along with what people wanted to see happen in their states. And it wasn't until the 6th ballot that...
And they called Carmine DeSapio in New York and talked to him about it.
It was my roommate. It wasn't DeSapio, but it was my roommate.
All right.
Well, thank you. Much more to cover, and there's 2.5 more days to do it. I think we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.